For anybody who's thinking, if you're a person, you have to process the experience through your worldview. So in the last couple of years, in particular, there's been sort of an emphasis and change to start focusing on the idea of lived experiences, and rather than focusing on data and evidence and what have you. And experiential knowledge isn't necessarily a bad thing. I know a group of psychologists and what have you who can speak to how useful that can be, in their studies of different phenomena and different things going on in society. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. The unfortunate thing with critical theory is that critical theory tends to focus on only the experiences that confirm its premises. For example, critical race theory has the premise that all people who don't happen to be white are oppressed, and particularly black people, and helpless, and they can't succeed in society. Whereas white people under critical race theory are oppressors, and everything is structured to their benefit. That's the assumption that is there as the foundational tenet of critical race theory, or foundational tenets are one of them. The explainer video, the little explainer video, talked about the first tenet, which is that critical race theory is assumes that racism is everywhere. And that's straight out of their textbook, if you doubt me. I included the quote from the foundational quote from their literature, describing that is one of the key tenets of critical race theory. They exist, that racism is everywhere and part of everyday life. The thing about the notion of lived experiences that bother me, particularly ones that confirm a premise, that's confirmation bias on the part of the critical race theorists and the critical theorists to seek that. But it also makes the assumption that everyone, that experience is what fully defines thought. And I want to make a point with this excellent essay written by Professor Randall Kennedy on the authority of experience in Black thought, where he made a very, very cogent point that I think is relevant to the discussion regarding lived experiences, in that, having an experience, and that's what I'm going to call it, as an experience, and I'll explain why in a second. Having an experience doesn't necessarily determine how you think or feel about that experience. Those are two very different things, and so that's why the centering lived experiences notion doesn't necessarily work as a consistent way to find evidence of racism, or evidence supporting an assumption in the case of critical theory and critical race theory. Why am I going to continue to refer to it as experience and not lived experience? Every experience, by definition, is lived. It is something you have gone through, something that has happened to you. There is no such thing that I know of as an unlived experience. So every experience you go through is an experience that you've lived, and such, the phrasing lived experience is redundant at that point. So that's why I'm not going to say it. It's an experience. It's not a lived experience. So let's read through this blog from the Heterodox Academy on the authority of experience in Black thought. From Professor Randall Kennedy. So the spectrum of thought amongst African Americans is and always has been much broader and multifarious than commonly perceived. Neglect of that fact has led to a homogenization that has tended to submerge African American individuality. And what he tends to do here is to actually go through a bunch of examples of how Black scholars and Black people in their different times have had very different thoughts about different issues here. In particular, going all the way through American history. 1776, some Blacks thought it would be in their interest would be best served by victory on the part of the American colonists in their struggle with the British Empire and fought with the rebels. More believed that their interests would be better served if King George prevailed and fought on behalf of the monarchy. In 1827, in the inaugural issue of Freedom's Journal, the first newspaper owned by African Americans, the editors announced that they would quote, ever regard the Constitution of the United States as their political star, end quote. By contrast, the great abolitionist and journalist and orator Frederick Douglass declared, "I cannot have any love for this country or its Constitution. I desire to see its overthrow as speedily as possible, and its Constitution shivered in 1,000 fragments." Now, interesting fun fact about Frederick Douglass: he would actually eventually change his mind on that when he came to realize that the that the ideas in the Constitution and in the Declaration of Independence themselves were themselves very good and very noble and very perfect. They just were imperfectly executed because people are imperfect. And so he changed his mind on that by the time of the Civil War. In his kind of sentiment and understanding would later be echoed by Martin Luther King, when Martin Luther King would say, hey, yes, this is a promissory note that hasn't been fulfilled yet, and we're going to make sure that Americans fulfill it. In 1868, when reformers proposed that the federal Constitution be amended by the 14th Amendment, most blacks urged that it be ratified. After all, the proposed amendment would constitutionalize the citizenship of blacks born in the United States and prohibit states from denying to anyone the, quote, privileges or immunities of citizens and or, quote, life, liberty, or property without a due process of law or, quote, the equal protection of laws. Some blacks, however, denounced the 14th Amendment because it implicitly permitted racial disenfranchisement. The two blacks in the Massachusetts legislature that considered the amendment voted against ratification, though a large majority of their colleagues voted the other way. So, again, serious disagreements right there. And it goes on, actually, because, Garvey and Du Bois disagreed tremendously with racial politics and anti-miscegenation laws. Black activist thinkers had a huge perspective. So you had a lot of optimists, which included Mary Bethune, Walter White, Philip Randolph, Martin Luther King, Ralph Ellison, John Lewis, Barack Obama. And there was also others who believed that coming to some level of racial justice in America is impossible. Believe it or not, Thomas Jefferson was like that at the start. Alex de Tocqueville, things like that. Other pessimists were like Malcolm X, Elijah Muhammad, Derek Bell, and Randall Robinson. Lots of fervent debates. And the point with all this is that, even within a group of people, this is why I can't stand a lot of the identity politics and critical theories, because you tend to make a presumption that all of them think the same. And these are thinkers of their time who thought very differently from each other, yet, we're the same race. I'm not going to say that because I think YouTube will get upset with me. There are several implications to be drawn from recognizing the frequently underestimated breadth, complexity, and variety of beliefs found amongst African Americans. One is the dubious utility of resorting to experience as an explanation for a given way of thinking. It is frequently said, for example, that the egalitarianism manifested in the jurisprudence of Justice Thurgood Marshall is a function of his experience as a black man oppressed by white supremacism. But what about the other black man also oppressed by white supremacism who responded very differently, such as Justice Clarence Thomas, who is deeply antagonistic toward the social egalitarianism that Marshall embraced? These are two people of their time. Thurgood Marshall, I think, passed away, if I'm not mistaken. Clarence Thomas is still on the High Court. But they had very different views of these kinds of things. They had very, very different views. And this is more philosophical today than scientific based, but like I said, this channel covers a little bit of philosophy too. But they had very different views, even though they had very, very similar experiences in their lifetimes. A wide variety of thought is discernible amongst people who have undergone a similar experience because experience does not dictate thought. It is undoubtedly influential, which is why one can detect notable demographic patterns from which one can chart probabilities. Yes, experiences are influential on your thought, but they don't dictate thought. In fact, your thought about an experience can change dramatically over your lifetime. As you look back on it, as you gain more knowledge, as your worldviews change. That's one thing people don't realize is and he gets into it, so let's get through this. It is probable that an African American will prefer the Democratic as opposed to the Republican candidate for president, but that does not mean the experience of a particular African American will necessarily determine the person's preferences. Experience affects thinking in all sorts of subtle, complex, mysterious, and surprising ways, but it does not determine thought. Hence, we ought to be skeptical about claims regarding, quote, the authority of experience and efforts to make a credential of experience. That a person has suffered impoverishment and marginalization is, alas, no guarantee that all that person will be attuned to. It's not a guarantee at all that person will be attuned to those social vices or immune to them. An experience at most is at most a fragile and uncertain opportunity. What matters is what one does with whatever experience one happens to have. There are plenty of African Americans who were enslaved but made little or nothing of intellectual interest from their ordeal. Frederick Douglass created much from his ordeal, which is one of the reasons he is so justly celebrated. And yes, the life of Frederick Douglass is freaking amazing, actually, if you go read about it, because he made his way out of slavery, became highly educated, called out his slave masters by name, afterwards published books left and right. He pressured Abraham Lincoln to no end about the Emancipation Proclamation, so his pressure is part of the reasons we celebrate Juneteenth now. If you think about it, alongside of Abraham Lincoln's Declaration and Emancipation Proclamation ordering the liberation of all slaves in the Confederacy. Let's see. Mere experience is not what produced his speeches and articles. It was his exertion of intelligence that produced those works. When discussing an African American thinker, when discussing any thinker, make sure to recognize appropriately the individuality of that person's intellectual offering. Mere experience has never produced a book or poem or essay or story. Accomplishment in whatever form it takes is always the upshot of some individual's peculiar effort. Yes. And that's the reason I wanted to read it. Professor Kennedy is an excellent professor from what I've read of him at the Harvard Law School. And he's right. He's very right. You can have two people who have the same experiences, and they don't have the same thought, feeling, belief about those experiences. You have an experience, yes, but it's up to you in your worldview, in your beliefs, in your intellect, to process that experience into what that experience means for you. It could mean you experienced racism. It could mean something completely different, like you just ran over a person with a bad day, having a bad day, and it was not meant. A good example, actually, I can give you. So I was at a DEI keynote a couple of months ago, in which at one point the presenter implied, she didn't come right out and say it, so I'll give her that, but she implied that having her name mispronounced, misspelled, being mistaken for someone else was a sign, was racist, essentially. It was a sign of systemic racism. And she also implied that not having not being able to find my name on one of those little keychains, that are mass-produced with people's names on them or on a mug or something similar, was also a sign of systemic racism. Okay. I shared that, what she had said in discussion with some colleagues and friends who were themselves Black or Hispanic or Asian or any number of different ethnicities that were present. And quite a number of them said, well, that's not racism and that's not offensive to me. And for record, the DEI keynote, the woman who spoke was Black. And so that's two very different things. The people who were Black in the group that I was talking to had a very different take on how they would think about that thing. And admittedly, some of them had experienced some of the same things. Actually, I've experienced some of the same things. You have no idea how many people mispronounce and misspell my name. It's really hysterical. Sometimes there are letters missing. Sometimes there's all sorts of things that happen. But is that because of systemic racism? Or is it because somebody's lazy and didn't proofread? Is it somebody just, they've never encountered something of that culture, and so they're not sure how to pronounce the name? That happens to me all the time because I deal with international students and things like that. So I'm just like, I have to double check, how do I pronounce the name? In the case of misspelling, I usually chalk it up to somebody being lazy and not proofreading. And I tend to ignore them. But that's not necessarily racism. Do you see what I mean? And the different ways that people could process the exact same experience. That's why the notion of centering lived experiences, or centering experiences, particularly those that confirm a premise from critical race theory or from critical theory, is actually pretty flawed. Because somebody else could have somebody else, saying that two Black people have the same exact experience, and they think very differently about, they have very different meaning that they create, that they put into that experience. That's why I don't like the notion of centering lived experiences, as it's called, because experience doesn't necessarily determine experience doesn't necessarily determine what you think, what meaning you give to it. And that's kind of important. That's really dependent a lot on your values and your worldview. And so it's not necessarily the most consistent thing to say that, I experienced this, therefore racism, or I experienced this, therefore bigotry, or things like that, when there might actually be a more reasonable explanation. In the case of, the keychains and things like that I talked about, well, yeah, you could assume it's systemic racism. Go for it. If you want to do that, go ahead. But there's actually possibly a more reasonable explanation for that. For example, the notion that, okay, most of those companies, they got to turn a profit, so they're going to put names on those things made in bulk that are likely to turn them a profit, which means they are names that need to be more common in the United States than other names. That doesn't necessarily mean that they dislike people. And so that's a profit thing. That's not necessarily someone being racist. And so that's important, dramatically important to understand. But not everybody does. But that's the point that I wanted to make with this video, was to point out the issue with using experiences to define whether or not something has occurred, because you've got to filter that through your worldview. And that's not just for Black people or Asian people or white people or anything like that. For anybody who's thinking, if you're a person, you have to process the experience through your worldview. There's been a lot of experiences in my life that I could scream up and down and say that I'm a victim. I'm not going to do that, because I don't believe in that. I'm not going to hold myself as a victim forever. Contrary-wise, the same thing for any other person. Hey, that's your worldview. That's the way you want to view yourself, and that's how you're processing your experience. Again, I don't necessarily agree with you. Go to town. But that's the point that I want to make. I don't think working with the notion of centering experiences of something is a good idea, because you're not accounting for the differences in worldview and the diversity and the rich diversity of thought that exists, diversity of worldview, diversity of thought, diversity of values that exists, that helps to make that experience have meaning for someone. The diversity of intellect that's there. And so I can really hope, and that's what I want to see more of in science, is a respect for the diversity of intellect, and diverse viewpoints. I hope that sticks around, and I'm worried that it's not going to stick around. But that's what I wanted to say with this short video. So if you like this video, like, share, comment, subscribe, all that good jazz. Of course, if you want more talking with me, you can head over to become a supporter of sciworthy.locals.com. It's as cheap as $3 a month, and I don't make any money off of it, so it's not for me. I'm just doing a shameless plug for a friend and for a group that I like to be a part of. Anyway, until next time, I'm Adrienne signing off. Stay curious, my friends.